the smallest patients in the world. There is a sound in a neonatal unit that you never forget. It is the sound of machines breathing for babies who cannot yet breathe on their own.
You do it,
It is the
Polly.
sound of alarms that go off in the night, sending nurses running across cold floors. It is the sound of parents whispering prayers through tears, sitting beside incubators that are barely bigger than their arms, staring at a child so small and so fragile that they are afraid to look away even for a moment. A neonatal unit is one of the most emotionally intense places on Earth. It exists at the exact meeting point between life and death. Every baby in that unit is fighting. Some were born too early, at 24 weeks, 26 weeks, 28 weeks. Their lungs not yet formed, their skin almost translucent, their fingers the size of a thumbnail. Others were born full term but arrived into the world with hearts that did not beat correctly, or lungs that struggled to expand, or bodies that could not regulate their own temperature. The parents of these babies are not prepared for any of it. Nobody is. You imagine your child's birth as a joyful thing, a moment of arrival, of beginning, of warmth and light. You do not imagine the rush of medical staff, the emergency procedures, the moment when your baby is taken from you and placed inside a plastic box filled with tubes and wires. You do not imagine sitting in a chair at 3 in the morning, holding your child's hand through a
That call
small
still
porthole
haunts
in
me.
an incubator,
We did what we could.
wondering whether you will
Tonight
get to
we get
take
it
them
right.
home. This is the world into which Lucy Letby walked every working day.
The numbers from
This is
last
the
night
world
look
she
bad.
was trusted to protect.
We did everything we could.
And this is the world inside which, the evidence would later prove, she did something that shattered the lives of dozens of people and sent a ripple of grief, anger, and disbelief through an entire nation. A nurse among the vulnerable. Lucy Letby was born on the 4th of January 1990 in Hereford, England. She grew up unremarkably. She was a quiet, polite young woman who did not attract attention. She studied nursing at the University of Chester, earning her Bachelor of Science in Nursing. She was trained to care. She was trained to protect. She was trained to stand at the bedside of the sick and do everything in her power to keep them alive. She began working at the Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal unit in 2012. For 3 years, nothing unusual was recorded. She was considered a capable nurse. She was trusted. She was given access to the most vulnerable patients in the hospital, premature infants who could not speak, could not call out, and who depended entirely on the people in that room with them. But between June 2015 and June 2016, something changed. In the space of 12 months, an unusual number of babies in that neonatal unit died. Others collapsed without warning and without clear medical explanation. The deaths came one after another, and with each one, the grief in the unit deepened. Nurses cried. Doctors felt helpless. Parents were destroyed. The doctors began to sense something was wrong. Not just the natural tragedy of premature infants struggling to survive, something else. Something that did not fit the normal pattern of loss in a place like this. Something that began to make them look at the numbers, look at the rosters, look at who was present when each incident occurred. And when they looked, they found the same name again and again. Lucy Letby. The weight of a mother's grief. Imagine being a mother who has just given birth to a baby too early. Your child weighs less than a bag of sugar. You have seen their face for only a few minutes before they were taken to the neonatal unit. You are still recovering from the birth. Your body is exhausted. Your heart is full to breaking with love and terror at the same time. You visit the unit every day. You learn the names of the nurses. You trust them. You have no choice but to trust them, because they are the only ones who know how to keep your child alive. You watch them adjust the machines, change the lines, monitor the readings. You see the care and focus on their faces. You believe they are fighting for your baby just as hard as you are. And then one night the phone rings. Your baby has collapsed. Come quickly. You run through hospital corridors, your heart hammering, your legs barely carrying you. You arrive and the room is full of activity, full of machines and voices and urgency. And you stand there at the edge of it all, helpless, watching other people try to save your child. Some of those parents made it in time to hold their baby one last time. Some did not. Some received a call that arrived too late for them to say goodbye. This is what happened to the families touched by Lucy Letby's crimes. Not once, not twice. 7 times at minimum, babies died, and in each case, there was a family on the other end of that tragedy. A mother, a father, grandparents, siblings who would grow up never knowing the brother or sister they were supposed to have. The grief of losing a child is unlike any other grief. There is something in it that does not obey the normal rules of mourning. You do not grieve someone you knew for a long time and then lost. You grieve a future. You grieve every birthday that will never happen, every first day of school, every laugh, every scraped knee, every hug. You grieve the entire life that was stolen before it could begin. And when those families eventually learned that the death of their child was not just tragic but deliberate, that it may have been caused by someone they had trusted, the grief did not just deepen. It transformed into something else entirely, into shock, into fury, into a kind of pain that does not have a word in the English language to describe it. The fathers who could not speak. We speak often about mothers when we talk about the loss of infants, but fathers carry this grief too, in ways that society does not always make space for. A father who loses a newborn baby is a man standing at the edge of something he cannot name. Society tells men to be strong. Society tells men to support their partners, to hold things together, to keep moving. It does not always give men the permission to fall apart. And so some of these fathers went back to work. Some of them drove the same roads, sat at the same desks, stared at the same walls. And inside them, quietly and without ceremony, something fundamental had broken. There were fathers connected to this case who stood outside that hospital. Fathers who held their partners' hands and searched for words that did not exist. Fathers who brought flowers to small graves and knelt in the cold and could not understand how the world was still turning around them when their world had stopped completely. The emotional impact of this case on the fathers, on the parents, on the siblings and grandparents and friends of the families involved cannot be overstated. When investigators and journalists began to piece together the full picture of what had happened at the Countess of Chester Hospital, it was not just a criminal story that emerged. It was a human catastrophe, layered, deep, and ongoing, a wound that would not close. Some families did not know for years that the death of their baby might have been criminal. They had been told their child died of natural causes. They had mourned under that understanding. They had slowly, painfully tried to rebuild. And then the investigation came. And then they were told, your child's death is being re-examined. There is a possibility it was not natural. Try to imagine what that moment feels like. Try to imagine having your grief ripped back open years after you buried it. Try to imagine being asked to revisit the worst moment of your life, to give statements, to sit through hearings, to hear your baby's death discussed in clinical terms in a courtroom. That is what these families endured. That is what Lucy Letby's crimes cost them. Not just the original loss, but the second loss of certainty, and the third loss of peace, the evidence that built a case. For the investigators and prosecutors who worked this case, the emotional weight was also immense. These were detectives and lawyers and expert witnesses who spent years examining the deaths of infants. They reviewed medical records. They studied tiny bodies. They asked clinical questions about the most devastating events imaginable. The case was built on several pillars of evidence, each one significant on its own and overwhelming in combination. The first was Lucy Letby's presence. She was on duty during an exceptional number of the incidents. In a neonatal unit with rotating staff, her repeated connection to individual episodes of infant collapse and death was statistically striking. It was not proof on its own, but it was a pattern that demanded explanation. The second was medical. 2 abnormal blood test results from infants were interpreted by expert witnesses as signs of insulin poisoning, evidence that insulin had been introduced artificially into their tiny bodies. Insulin, which controls blood sugar, can cause catastrophic harm in a premature infant if administered in dangerous quantities. This is not something that happens by accident. It is not something that happens naturally. It requires deliberate action. Additionally, skin discoloration in some of the affected infants was interpreted as a sign of air embolism, air deliberately introduced into the bloodstream. Air in the bloodstream is lethal. It travels through the body and blocks blood flow. It causes organs to fail. It kills silently and quickly. In a premature infant, it requires very little. The amount of air that could kill a tiny baby is a fraction of what would harm an adult. The third pillar was the medical records themselves. Alleged inconsistencies were found, places where the documentation of events did not fully align with what had occurred, where details appeared to have been altered or omitted. The fourth pillar was the removal of nursing handover sheets. These documents are the paper trail of care in a neonatal unit. They record what happened on each shift. When Lucy Letby took them, she was removing evidence. That act alone, taking documents that should have remained in the hospital, spoke to a consciousness of guilt. And the fifth, and perhaps the most haunting, was the handwritten notes, found among her personal belongings, words written in her own hand. The prosecution characterized these notes as a confession, words of self-incrimination, words that no innocent person could fully explain. A private accounting of something she had done and could not stop thinking about. The families of the victims heard this evidence. They sat through the presentations of clinical data about their babies' deaths. They listened to expert witnesses describe the manner in which their children were believed to have been harmed. And they endured it all with a courage that is almost impossible to comprehend. The hospital that should have listened. One of the most painful dimensions of this story is not what one person did. It is what a system failed to do. The clinicians, the doctors and senior nurses working in that neonatal unit, saw the pattern forming. They felt it in their bones long before they had the data to support it. Something was wrong. Babies were dying in numbers that did not make sense. The pattern of collapses did not match what experience told them to expect. They raised their concerns with hospital management. They were not immediately believed. They were not acted upon swiftly enough. Senior management at the Countess of Chester Hospital were officially and publicly criticized for failing to act on the concerns that clinicians raised. This was not a minor administrative failure. This was a failure at the level of institutional responsibility. A failure that had consequences measured not in paperwork, but in lives. Every week that passed without action was a week in which more babies were potentially at risk. Every meeting that ended without a decision to investigate properly was a meeting in which the institution chose its reputation over the safety of its most vulnerable patients. This is the nature of institutional failure. It rarely looks like malice. It looks like hesitation. It looks like committees and caution and the fear of being wrong. It looks like senior leaders not wanting to believe that something this terrible could be happening in their hospital, under their watch, on their record. And so they wait, and they question the clinicians, and they worry about reputation. And in the space created by that inaction, harm continues. The British government eventually commissioned an independent statutory inquiry to examine exactly what happened at the management level. That inquiry began hearings in September 2024. It is asking the hard questions. It is pulling back the curtain on the culture of a hospital where warning signs were raised and ignored. And the findings will matter not just for Chester, but for every hospital in the country. The families of the victims know this truth intimately. Some of them have spoken publicly about their belief that earlier action could have saved their babies. That knowledge, the possibility that intervention could have come sooner, is its own form of grief. A grief layered on top of grief. The community that was shaken. The impact of Lucy Letby's crimes was not contained to the families of the victims. It spread outward through the entire community. Chester is not a large city. The Countess of Chester Hospital is its hospital. It is the place where people in that community are born, where they are treated, where some of them die. It is a place of trust. When the story broke, when the full picture of what had happened inside that neonatal unit became public, the community reacted with something close to collective disbelief. Parents who had given birth at that hospital began to ask questions. Mothers who had spent time in that neonatal unit with their own babies began to think back and wonder. Nurses and doctors who had worked alongside Lucy Letby began a process of painful self-examination, searching their memories for signs they might have missed. The guilt of not seeing it sooner, of not stopping it sooner, weighed on many of them deeply. The nursing profession felt the impact too. Neonatal nurses across the country, dedicated, caring, exhausted professionals who had spent their careers fighting for the smallest and sickest patients, found themselves having to navigate public suspicion and fear. Most nurses never harmed a patient in their lives. Most nurses would give anything to save every baby in their care. But the revelation that one of their own had done what Lucy Letby was convicted of doing cast a shadow over a profession that did not deserve it. Hospitals across Britain reviewed their safeguarding protocols. NHS trusts looked at their own neonatal units. Questions were asked about monitoring, about reporting, about what checks exist to protect patients from the people who care for them. This was necessary. It was overdue. But it came at a cost, the cost of trust. And rebuilding trust in medical institutions, once it is shattered, is a long and difficult process. The community of Chester did not simply move on. Communities rarely do after something like this. The grief became civic. It became shared. It became a question that the city carried collectively. How did this happen here? And how do we make sure it never happens again? The trial and the verdict. The trial of Lucy Letby began in Manchester, moved for security and logistical reasons, and lasted longer than almost any other criminal trial in recent British history. The jury, 12 ordinary people who had signed up for jury service without any idea they would end up deciding one of the most consequential cases of their generation, heard months of evidence. They heard from medical experts who explained insulin poisoning and air embolism. They heard from statistical experts who discussed the probability of a single nurse being present at so many incidents by chance. They heard from former colleagues who gave their accounts of working alongside Lucy Letby. They saw the handwritten notes. They heard about the removed handover sheets. They processed a vast and complex landscape of evidence. For the families watching from the public gallery or following the proceedings from their homes, the trial was its own form of ordeal. To sit through the clinical examination of your child's death, to hear lawyers argue about whether the evidence was sufficient, to watch the woman accused of killing your baby sit in the dock and maintain her innocence, to wait, day after day and week after week, for a verdict that might never come. In August 2023, the jury delivered their verdicts. Guilty on 7 counts of murder, guilty on 7 counts of attempted murder, acquitted on 2 counts of attempted murder, not guilty on those 2 cases, meaning the jury found the evidence was not strong enough to be certain beyond reasonable doubt. On 6 further counts of attempted murder, the jury could not agree. They were deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous decision, and those cases remained unresolved. Lucy Letby received 14 whole life orders, the most severe sentence in the British justice system. No parole, no release. She will die in prison. One of the unresolved charges was retried in July 2024. A new jury found her guilty. A 15th whole life order was added. In the public gallery and in homes across Britain, people wept. Some wept with relief that the process had reached its conclusion. Some wept because no verdict, however correct, could give them back what they had lost. Some wept because the weight of what they had heard over the preceding months had finally been allowed to leave their bodies in the only way left available to them. The survivors and their future 7 babies died, but others survived. 7 counts of attempted murder resulted in guilty verdicts, meaning 7 other infants had been harmed and had somehow survived. These children are alive today. They are growing up in families who love them, in homes that fought for them, carried by parents who never fully stopped being afraid, even after they brought their baby home from that hospital. Some of them are too young to understand what happened to them. Some will be told one day, in the careful, loving words that parents use when they must explain terrible things to children. Some will carry physical effects from what happened to their tiny bodies in those first weeks of life. Some may never know the full story, but they are alive, and their survival is both a miracle and a source of complicated emotion for their families. Because the parents of these surviving children live with a particular kind of knowledge. They know that someone tried to take their baby from them. They know how close it came. They know that the machines that kept their child alive also kept the evidence of what was done to them. And they carry that knowledge in the way you carry a scar, always there, not always visible but felt whenever the light catches it at the wrong angle. For those children who survived, there are questions about long-term health. The harm that was inflicted in their earliest and most fragile days may have consequences that are only beginning to reveal themselves as they grow. Some families are managing medical complexities. Some are watching for developmental issues. Some are simply praying that the damage was not lasting. There is also the emotional weight that these families carry into every ordinary moment of their children's lives. A birthday becomes not just a celebration of how old your child is, but a reminder of how close you came to having no birthdays at all. A first word, a first step, a first day of school. Every milestone arrives with a shadow attached to it. The shadow of what almost was not. This is the invisible cost of crime that reaches into the very beginning of life. It does not end with a verdict. It does not end with a sentence. It travels forward with the survivors and their families into every year that comes after. The nurses who knew something was wrong. Among the people carrying the heaviest emotional burdens from this case are the healthcare professionals who worked alongside Lucy Letby and who in some cases suspected something was wrong long before the investigation began. Imagine being a nurse in that unit. Imagine working side by side with a colleague, trusting them, relying on them, covering shifts together in the depths of the night when the rest of the world was asleep. And then imagine realizing slowly, horribly, gradually, that something about what was happening in your unit did not make sense, that the pattern of deaths and collapses was not right, that the coincidences were too many. Some of the clinicians at the Countess of Chester raised their concerns repeatedly and were not listened to quickly enough. For those individuals, the knowledge that they had tried to raise the alarm and had not been believed carries its own form of trauma. The guilt of wondering whether more could have been done, said more loudly, pushed harder. The frustration of being ignored by people with the power to act. For those who did not suspect anything, who worked in good faith beside Lucy Letby without any idea of what she was allegedly doing, the revelation of her convictions was devastating in a different way. It was a betrayal of the most fundamental kind. The professional world they had believed in, the team they had trusted, had been infiltrated by something they could not have imagined. Healthcare professionals are not trained to suspect their colleagues of murder. They are trained to work together, to trust one another's professional judgment, to function as a team under extraordinary pressure. When that trust is violated at the most extreme level, it does not just damage the individuals involved. It damages the professional culture itself. It makes the next generation of nurses and doctors more cautious, more watchful, more burdened with a suspicion they did not ask for and do not want. This is another consequence of Lucy Letby's crimes that does not appear in any court document, but is real and lasting. The ripple of mistrust that spreads through a profession when one of its own is found to have done the unthinkable. Voices of doubt. The challenge to the evidence. After the verdict was delivered and the reporting restrictions were lifted, the story did not end. A number of respected medical and statistical experts came forward with serious challenges to the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. These were not people with obvious agendas. They were scientists and clinicians who had examined the evidence carefully and concluded that there were significant questions about whether the conclusions drawn by the prosecution's experts were as solid as the trial had presented them to be. On the statistical side, experts argued that the presence of a single nurse during multiple incidents in a small neonatal unit was not as statistically remarkable as the prosecution had suggested. Small units with small teams mean that individual nurses will naturally appear at a higher proportion of incidents simply because there are fewer people to spread that presence across. The mathematics of coincidence in a small unit behaves differently from the mathematics of coincidence in a large one. On the medical side, questions were raised about the insulin findings. The interpretation of blood test results as evidence of insulin poisoning was challenged, with some experts arguing that the testing methodology and the conclusions drawn from it were not sufficiently rigorous to be used as proof of deliberate harm. Questions were also raised about the air embolism evidence, about whether the clinical signs interpreted as evidence of air in the bloodstream might have had other explanations. 2 applications for permission to appeal were submitted to the Court of Appeal. Both were refused. The court did not find sufficient grounds to overturn the convictions. But the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the independent body established specifically to examine potential miscarriages of justice, received a preliminary application to refer the case back to the courts. That application was still being considered at the time of writing. This part of the story is important not because it tells us Lucy Letby is innocent. The jury heard months of evidence and reached their verdicts. But it reminds us that justice is a living process, that the search for truth does not end with a single verdict, and that the system has safeguards precisely because human institutions, however careful, are capable of error. The families of the victims deserve certainty, and that certainty can only come from a process that is willing to examine itself honestly, however uncomfortable that examination may be. What the consequences of crime really look like. We talk about crime in terms of sentences, years in prison, whole life orders, fines, probation. These are the formal consequences, the ones written in law, handed down by judges, recorded in documents. But the real consequences of crime are not found in documents. They are found in people. They are found in the father who drives past the cemetery on his way to work every morning. He does not stop the car. He cannot always stop the car. But he glances over as he passes, and for a moment his hands tighten on the steering wheel, and he breathes through something that never fully goes away. They are found in the mother who keeps the small hat her baby wore in the incubator. She keeps it in a box at the top of a wardrobe. She does not look at it often, but she knows it is there. And on the worst nights, when the grief comes back in the way that grief does, without warning, without mercy, she takes it out and holds it and tries to remember everything she was not given enough time to learn. They are found in the siblings who grow up in households shaped by loss. Children who sense, even without being told everything, that something is missing from their family. Children who see their parents sometimes go quiet in a way that has nothing to do with them. Children who will one day be old enough to understand. They are found in the doctors and nurses who dedicated their working lives to saving babies, and who now carry the weight of not having stopped this sooner, who replay the moments they might have noticed more, said more, pushed harder. They are found in the community of Chester, in the parents who gave birth there and wonder, in the healthcare workers who served that hospital with honor and found their profession shadowed. They are found in the broader culture, in the way we now think about safeguarding, about whistleblowing, about the systems that are supposed to protect the most vulnerable from the people trusted to care for them. Crime does not touch one person. It spreads. It moves through families and communities and institutions and time. The consequences do not end with a prison sentence. They continue long after the courtroom doors are closed. That is the truth about crime that the newspapers do not always find space to tell. But it must be told, because when we understand the full weight of what crime costs, not just in legal terms but in human terms, we understand why prevention matters more than punishment, why systems must be built to catch danger before it happens, why trust once broken at this level requires years and immense effort to rebuild. What we must learn, the lessons that cannot be ignored. Every story, as profound and painful as this one, carries the obligation to teach, not just to inform, but to change something, to leave the world slightly more equipped to prevent the next tragedy, or to catch it sooner, or to respond to it better when it comes. The first lesson is about the courage to raise an alarm. The clinicians at the Countess of Chester Hospital saw the pattern. They raised their concerns. They were not acted upon quickly enough. In every institution, in hospitals, in schools, in police forces, in corporations, there will be moments when someone on the ground sees something that the people above them do not want to see. The lesson of this case is that those voices must not be silenced. They must not be dismissed. They must be taken seriously, investigated properly, and acted upon without delay. A culture that punishes or ignores whistleblowers is a culture that makes space for harm. The second lesson is about institutional accountability. The senior management of the Countess of Chester Hospital did not act quickly enough. They were criticized for it. They should be criticized for it. Leadership in healthcare, in any environment where vulnerable lives are at stake, carries a profound responsibility. That responsibility cannot be discharged behind a desk or inside a committee meeting. It requires leaders who are willing to face uncomfortable truths, even when those truths are damaging to the institution's reputation, to its recruitment, to its standing in the community. Reputation is nothing beside a human life. The third lesson is about safeguarding systems. No individual nurse or doctor should be the last line of protection for a vulnerable patient. Systems must be designed to catch what individuals miss. Regular review of incident patterns, independent audit of deaths and serious events in neonatal units, clear escalation pathways that allow concerns to reach the right people quickly, without fear of professional consequences. These are not bureaucratic luxuries. They are moral necessities. The fourth lesson is about the complexity of truth. The experts who challenged the prosecution's evidence remind us that certainty in complex medical cases is hard to achieve. Courts must be places where evidence is tested rigorously, where expert witnesses are held to the highest scientific standards, and where the principle of proof beyond reasonable doubt is not eroded by the emotional weight of the crimes alleged. The families of victims deserve truth, not just verdicts. And truth is only found through a process that is willing to examine itself. The fifth lesson is about how we respond to grief. The families at the center of this case were not given adequate support quickly enough. When bereaved parents later discovered that their children's deaths were being investigated as possible crimes, they were not always met with the care and communication they needed. Institutions that cause harm, even inadvertently, must develop the ability to communicate with affected families honestly, compassionately, and in a timely way. That is not just a matter of policy. It is a matter of basic human decency. And the sixth lesson, which runs through every other one, is about the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Newborn babies are the most defenseless human beings on earth. The systems we build around them, the training of the people who care for them, the monitoring of those units, the culture of the hospitals in which they are treated, must be strong enough and robust enough to stand as a shield between those babies and whatever threat might emerge. That shield failed here. It must not fail again. After the verdict, where things stand. Lucy Letby is currently imprisoned at HM Prison Bronzefield. She was born in January 1990. She is in her mid-30s. The whole life orders attached to her convictions mean she will spend the rest of her natural life inside prison walls. She will grow old there. She will die there. There is no legal mechanism available to her that will result in her release, barring an extraordinary reversal on appeal. Whether or not she has ever fully accepted what she was convicted of doing is not something anyone outside the walls of that prison can know. What we do know is that she maintained her innocence throughout the trial and through the appeals process. The Court of Appeal twice refused permission to appeal. The Criminal Cases Review Commission is considering a preliminary application. The independent statutory inquiry is examining the management failures at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The hearings began in September 2024 and continue. Cheshire Police examined additional cases beyond those that went to trial. The Crown Prosecution Service having reviewed the evidence in those additional cases, declined to bring further charges. This means some families will not receive a formal legal answer to what happened to their babies. The government inquiry will eventually report its findings. Those findings will likely result in changes to NHS policy, to the management structures of neonatal units, to the protocols for raising and responding to clinical concerns, and to the ways in which hospitals communicate with bereaved families during investigations. Those changes cannot come soon enough. The babies at the center of this case are not statistics. They had names. They had families who loved them before they were even born. They were tiny lives that deserved the chance to grow into something, into someone, into people with favorite colors and first friends and school photographs and all the unremarkable, magnificent ordinariness of a full life. They were not given that chance, but in being remembered, in having their cases heard, in driving policy changes, in forcing a reckoning with institutional failures, perhaps something of their brief existence reaches forward through time and touches the lives of the babies who come after them. Perhaps the lesson of their tragedy saves someone else. Perhaps the changes made in their names protect a family somewhere from the unbearable knowledge of what these families now carry. Remember them. Say their cases matter, because they do. This story matters. Subscribe, share, and comment. You just experienced one of the most emotionally devastating and morally complex true stories of our time. This was not entertainment. This was truth. The truth about what happens when the people entrusted with the most sacred duty, the protection of the most vulnerable lives on earth, betray that trust. The truth about families broken by grief that will never fully heal. The truth about institutions that failed and communities that were shaken. The truth about a justice system working, imperfectly and slowly, to find its way to answers. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the weight of what these families endured, if it made you think about the systems that protect the vulnerable in your own community, if it left you with questions that you will carry forward, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. This channel exists because stories like this one deserve to be told properly. Not with sensationalism, not with cruelty, but with honesty, with emotional depth, and with the respect that the people at the center of these stories are owed. We do not look away from the hard parts. We do not soften the truth to make it easier to hear. We believe that the most important stories are often the most difficult ones. And we believe that telling them well, telling them fully, is one of the most meaningful things we can do. If you believe that too, then here is what you need to do right now. Hit that subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything. Every subscriber is a person who has decided that these stories matter, that truth matters, that the people at the center of these events deserve an audience that takes them seriously. Be one of those people. Share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it, post it, forward it. Put it somewhere where the people in your life can find it. Sharing is how these stories reach the people they are meant to reach. Sharing is how a channel like this grows from something small into something that can tell many more stories, many more times for many more people. And comment below. Tell us what you took from this story. Tell us what made you angry, what made you cry, what made you think. Tell us which lesson hit you hardest. Ask the questions you are still carrying. This community is built by the people who engage with it, and your voice, your specific individual perspective, makes this space richer for everyone who comes here. The families in this story did not choose to have their grief made public, but they have chosen, many of them, to speak, to testify, to push for answers and for change. The least we can do is listen. The least we can do is remember. Subscribe, share, comment. These stories will keep coming. The next one is waiting. And if this one meant something to you, if you felt the weight of it and you want to feel that kind of meaningful storytelling again, then stay with us. We will see you on the next story.